Hi, my name is Kerry Critchlow from RCR Recording Studios. I hope you're all having a happy new year. And with the new year, a great place to start is going to be LFOs, or low frequency oscillators. I wasn't sure whether we should start with LFOs as they're a little bit complex, and to be fully transparent, this concept actually took me a little bit of time to wrap my head around. And so if you find yourself not quite getting it immediately, that's fine. But the more you kind of dig into this, and the more time you spend trying to wrap your head around it, the more sense it will make. But if you don't get it in one video, that's completely understandable. There's a lot of other videos that will probably cover this concept as well that you can dig into, and maybe approaching it from a different point of view may help. But this can be kind of a heady topic, but it is the building blocks of all modulation effects. And so I thought we should probably start with LFOs, just because everything else that you're going to be looking at when it comes to modulation, your chorus effects, your flangers, your phaser, etc., they're all utilizing these LFOs within them, and creating their sounds with them, generally speaking, at least in a digital sense. Very few people are mechanically creating these things anymore. But anyways, let's dig into it. LFOs just is a shorthand for low frequency oscillators. And I think that there's an important distinction to make, or at least I think it's important to know what an oscillator is before diving into what exactly an LFO is. So an oscillator is an electronic device which generates a single cycle basic waveform which is looped at an incredibly high rate to reproduce a specific pitch. So let's dig into what that actually is, and a great place to start is going to be looking at a synthesizer. So we're going to go ahead and load up our synthesizer here. Now, you don't, all synthesizers work in exactly the same way. They may not have all the features, or the interface may not look exactly like this. We may cover some other interfaces to make it a little bit simpler for you, but all synthesizers are going to have the same basic features. They're going to have essentially four sections. They're going to have a waveform generator. They're going to have a filter section, an envelope section, and an LFO section. Not all synthesizers will have like effects and all these other options available to you, but that's neither here nor there. We're going to get into synthesis in more detail in future videos, and that's kind of what all of this is building towards: learning about our compressions, EQs, delays, filters, reverbs, all that kind of fun jazz. This is all building towards being able to use synthesizers and creating sound design, and being able to really take control of the sounds that you're going to be incorporating into your musical productions. And so what we're going to do for now is we're going to ignore all of this other stuff going on in the synthesizer. We're going to focus right here on this waveform generator. All right. Now, let's go ahead and initialize this. And initialize is just basically resetting everything to default. We're turning everything off, basically. And we're going to start with our waveform generator. Now, when it comes to waveforms, there are millions, infinite amount of waveforms that can be generated. And each waveform, you can think of it as like if you were to play. Well, let's do this real quick. Maybe this will help sort of give you a concept of this. Let's bring up. And this may be the long way to go around it, but I think ultimately it will makes the most sense doing it this way. We're going to bring up a couple instances of a sampler here. And we're going to go ahead and bring up a piano. And we're going to just quickly do a very simple scale here. So this is a C major scale. And if you've watched previous videos, you should be able to know what that is and why it is. But anyways, that's our C major scale. We're just going to copy paste it, and we're going to choose a different instrument, maybe a violin. Which doesn't... Oop. Okay. The reason I had to move it up an octave because a violin doesn't have a register down below this G there. So we're just going to bring it up an octave, and here's our violin. All right. Playing the exact same thing, just an octave up. And then we are going to convert both of these to audio. All right, so it's taken the MIDI notes and it's created an audio track of this. And we're going to zoom in, and we're actually going to zoom in on these tracks a little bit so that we can really see what's going on. And as you can see, these are the waveforms generated by those instruments. Maybe we'll come over here just so that we can see a little bit better what's going on. But there's differences. You can see that a piano looks different than a violin. And if we were to do a bass or a guitar or whatever, all instruments, they're going to have a unique waveform, which is these little lines that are moving up and down in these sort of, and they call them waves because they look kind of like ocean waves. If you can imagine that, if you're on an ocean and here's the water and it's making waves, right, as it goes. And so these are waveforms, and they can be pretty complex depending on the type of instrument you're using, but they're different from each other, right? So, and that's what makes a piano sound different than a violin. They have different waveforms. A bass is going to look different from both of these as well. And so these waveforms are what are giving the sound its characteristic, and what makes it possible for you to distinguish between whether you're hearing a piano or a violin. All right. And so those are the waveforms. So hopefully this is making sense and you're tracking with me. What an oscillator does is it generates waveforms, but it does it, generally speaking, there are some fundamental waveforms, and that's what we're primarily going to focus on, but I wanted to bring that up because there are infinite amount of waveforms out there. Okay? And the four basic waveforms are a saw, a sine, a square, and a triangle. And they each have their own characteristics. So a saw looks kind of like a saw blade, which is why it's called a saw. And it kind of has a steady rise up, and then a sharp dip, and then a rise back up. A sine wave looks like a very smooth wave, right? Very rounded and very smooth. A square is just a straight line, and then a drop, and then a straight line, and then a rise, right, at a 90-degree angle up, and so on and so forth, and it looks very squarish. And then we have a triangle, which has a rise up and then a rise down, like a triangle. You can see that they were very creative in coming up with these names for these waveforms. And so this should be making sense, and each one of these is going to have a different characteristic. So I probably should not have deleted these. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our piano here, put it on there, and now we have a scale going up, a C major scale, and this is what it would sound like as a saw. All right, kind of a little grimy, a little more, a little distortion, like little like harsh, I scratchy. I don't know what the right word is, but that's what a saw is going to sound like. This waveform here, just a rise up and then a drop and then a rise up. And what's happening is that this waveform is being repeated a lot of times. If we go back to our definition, an oscillator is an electric switch device, a single cycle. This is what our single cycle looks like. And then it is looped at an incredibly high rate to reproduce a specific pitch. And the pitch is determined upon what MIDI note we're using, but and also the amount of times it cycles. The less, the lower the frequency of the cycles, which is why we call it frequency in hertz, but a lower frequency or a lower cycle, a slower cycle, is going to produce lower pitch. And if it's done fast, it's going to be higher pitched. And so it'll go faster. And maybe we can even get an idea of that to a degree here. If we really zoom in here. So if we zoom in, we can see the waveform goes up and then drops and then goes up, and it looks like a saw, right? Just like when we were looking at our pianos and stuff earlier. Now, it's going to be tricky to see here, but as it's going up this scale here, each note is going from a lower pitch to a slightly higher pitch. And so what's happening is that, and you can kind of see it, but not really. Actually, here, let's do this. This might even be a better example. Let's get rid of this scale, and let's do octaves instead. So we'll start. We can even go, can we go lower? Yeah, we can. Okay. You are not going to hear this note if you are on a phone or a bad set of speakers. Like, this is just a very, like, too low to be heard. Okay. And then it'll be each subsequent octave we go up will be a little bit easier to hear. And I promise this will all make sense here in a little bit. And that's probably all right. So we're doing 6 octaves, and then we're going to do that same thing. We are going to okay. The notes there is just too low to be seen on this particular panel. Anyways, we're going to convert this to audio. And now, when we zoom in, you'll see that for the low note, the low pitch stuff, that there's more space between these two peaks here, this peak and this peak. There's some space there. And then when we get to the next note, you'll notice that there's less space between these two, right? Because this saw is happening, cycling faster through its frequency, so it's creating a higher pitch. And so the time between these two things, that's creating the pitch difference that you're hearing. Now, I know this is probably a little boring for some of you, but as you can see, it's getting faster and faster the higher the pitch goes. And we'd have to zoom in even more to see the space in between here and then on the final. So it's getting faster and faster and faster, and those higher frequencies are what's creating the higher pitch, or the slower frequency is creating the lower pitch. Now, this is all going to come into play, I promise, but this is, I think, going to be helpful background knowledge to have moving forward. So you can see just how the space, the frequency of the cycle is increasing as it goes forward. And if we were to play this, this is not going to sound probably great, but you can kind of, just to hear the example of it. So we're going to have our lowest pitch here. And again, you're not going to hear this if you're not listening on a pretty good set of speakers, because it's just too low for most like cell phones and poor speakers to reproduce. But as it rises up the pitch, you'll probably be able to hear it a little bit better. All right. And so that is a saw. And you can see that the more frequency that happens, the higher the pitch, and the less frequency or the lower frequencies, the lower the pitch. Okay. So that's what a saw sounds like. If we go back into our waveform generator here, we can listen to a sine wave. And this is going to have a smoother, rounder sound to it because it's a smoother and rounder waveform. And again, you're not going to hear the absolute lowest notes. Even on a good set of speakers, this might be a little hard to hear. I can barely hear it in my headphones here. All right. And so you hear what a sine wave sounds like. And it's kind of like almost flutish, I guess. Very round, very smooth sounding. You're probably hearing it best in these frequencies here. And again, if we were to just convert this really quick into a waveform, or into an audio form, we can zoom in and we can see the sine wave. And that's what's creating those notes. And these lower frequency cycles are creating lower pitches that you can barely hear. And then they're getting faster and more frequency. Faster again, and etc. And so that when we get all the way to over here, these frequencies are happening so fast that you have to zoom in quite a bit in order to even see them. As relative to here, like you can see like the scale of it, how much space is between these two peaks versus when we come all the way to the end, there's barely any space at all. So, and those are creating your high and low pitches. We also have, going back to our waveforms here, make me do that. A square. And again, we're not going to do the converting audio thing anymore because I think you guys are getting the idea. It's just going to look like this, square repeating a bunch of times. And the lower frequencies, there's going to be more space between the peaks, and the higher frequencies, there's going to be less space between the peaks. But we'll play the square so that you can get like a concept of what a square sounds like. All right. And so that has a little bit of harshness to it as well, sort of like the saw. To me, it kind of reminds me of like 8-bit video games, like old school 80s video games with that kind of sort of tonality, if you will. But you can hear it's got a little bit of grit and griminess, not as much as a saw, but more than a sine, for instance. And so that's what a square wave sounds like. And then we have a triangle, and we'll play that for you. All right. And so that was a little bit more tamer than a square, but a little harsher than a sine. So I would say a sine is going to be your smoothest, purest sort of sound when it comes to these waveforms. Then a triangle is going to be a little bit harsher, a little bit more gritty than a square, and then a saw, like is in order from smoothest to harshest. Okay. And then you can combine these sounds, you can create different ones, but these are the 4 basic ones. And then you can go and you can create weird looking ones as well. So this is a MS square. I don't know what the MS stands for at all, but it's sort of a square, but it's got a little bit of a dip. It's not a perfect square, but it looks kind of squarish. Here's another kind of squarish sort of looking thing. This is more like a saw. A pulse, but like as you can see, these are all just variations on the different waveforms, and you can use them to create different types of sounds. So like This is kind of like a triangle almost. And if we play it, we'll play it over here so that you can kind of hear it a little bit better. It's got a little bit more grit going on. And then you can get real crazy into like some very crazy looking waveforms, which are going to actually look a little bit more like actual instruments, maybe even like a piano or a bass or whatever. Like, right, where it's a little bit like this is sort of like a sine wave. It's going to, which tells you it's going to sound a little bit smoother, but it's not consistent, and so it's going to have a little bit of variation in it. And so if you were to play this, it's not going to sound exactly like a sine wave. But it's got a little bit of that character to it, right? And so all of these sounds, all of these waveforms are generating those sounds. So you understand that this is an oscillator, and this oscillator is creating the waveform generator, and then it's oscillating between these waveforms very quickly. All of that is to say that an oscillator is going to create these waveforms, and depending on the frequency is going to determine the pitch, the sound, and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm hoping this all makes sense. Where this comes into play is when you have a low frequency oscillator, what it is doing is it's taking these waveforms, these oscillators, and it is using the shape of these oscillators in order to control parameters over time. So let's look at what is an LFO. And we covered this a little bit in last week's video, but it's good to get a little bit of a review. And like I said, you don't have to wrap your head around this immediately today, but the more you dig into this, the more sense it's going to make. But what is an LFO? It is a low-frequency audio oscillator, or an LFO, is an electronic device that generates a repeating waveform at a very low frequency, typically below the range of human hearing, which is usually between 20 hertz, which is used to modulate other audio parameters in a synthesizer or effects unit, creating effects like vibrato or filter sweeps by subtly changing the sound over time. Essentially, it's an oscillator that produces inaudible waves to create audible variations in sound. Now, I know that sounds super complex, but we're going to get into this, okay? What this oscillator LFO is going to do is it's taking these oscillated waveforms. So let's go back to maybe like a more basic shape. Maybe a square, just for funsies. All right, this isn't super important right now, but we'll get into this more later. Here's our square waveform, and I am going to actually real quickly go back to just our scale, so that this is going to be audible for people. Okay. Excuse me. Let's actually, I really should have thought this through. Let's do it quarter notes instead. So again, this is just a C major scale. And you can watch previous videos to get a better understanding of what that is if you don't fully understand it right now, or if you're not familiar with scales, I have a video that goes over that. I think it's like one of my earlier ones in the playlist. But anyways, there we go. So we have our scale, very simple. And what we want to do is we want to have the sound of this square change over time. We don't want it to be stagnant. We don't want it to sound the same, note to note, or, measure to measure, or whatever. We want it to change. And so we can pick what we want it to change about it. And so some common ones are going to be volume, pitch, filters. There's a lot of different ways that we can go about this, but what we essentially are going to do is we're going to use this sine wave, or whatever shape you want. We can use other shapes, squares, triangles, squares, etc. But we're going to start with a sine, and we're going to use it to control our volume. And we're going to do that by coming over here, and we're going to tell it to control our volume. When it comes to LFO, there's generally speaking going to be a few different options on how you can go about doing this. The first is going to be the shape of it. So the shape of our LFO, we're going to just be a sine, which is going to be a smooth up and a smooth down, right, as it goes. We need to choose the parameter we want it to change, and in this case, we're going to do volume. And then if we come down here, we can have it do various things. A loop means that it's going to go through this cycle and then come back and do the cycle again. If we take loop off, it means it's going to go through this cycle and then it's done changing. It's no longer going to be affected by this anymore. So it's just going to do it one time and it's done. A loop means it's going to continuously go through this cycle over and over again for infinity. Retriggering essentially means that this has more to do with as you're playing, but each of these notes, if you start the minute you play a different note, it's going to start at the beginning. So if you got here and then you played a note, it would immediately jump back to over here. And then if you played a new note here, it would jump back here instead of going all the way through. If you take retrigger off, no matter what you do, no matter what note is being played, it's just going to go through this cycle all the way without being interrupted. And a retrigger is just, it will interrupt where it is in this motion and start over from the top the moment a new note is triggered. A sync is going to allow you to sync it to the tempo of your DAW. So if you push on sync, it's going to automatically make it so that this sine wave is going at the rate of your DAW, the tempo of your DAW, which in this case is 120. Or you can turn it off and have it be manually controlled, or however you want to do it. Delay is how long it will take before this kicks in. So you can play the note and it will delay for a second, 1 second, and then it will start to do the movement. So it'll just sound regular for the first second, and then after that first second, then the changes will happen. The depth is how much of the effect you're getting. So if you want it to be a subtle volume thing, you can have the depth lower. If you want it to be very in your face, you can have the depth to 100%. This is kind of like a mix knob in a very real sense. So the more this depth is up, the more that this LFO, the more of this effect you're going to hear. The rate is how fast it's happening. If you have it on sync, it's going to go by hertz. And if you notice, this is 2 hertz. And the highest it can go is 200 hertz. And remember, LFOs generally are under 20 hertz. So that's about, close to 20 hertz right there. So you can actually go above that if you want, and you can get some crazy effects if you go with a higher rate. And that's the frequency, how fast it's moving through the changes, if you will. And then the phase will allow you to kind of start the movement in a different spot if you want. So instead of starting right here, you can have it start at the top and then come down and then go up, right? So it's still the sine wave. It's just a matter of where you're happening. So we've gone through these controls, and this may or may not make any sense to you yet, but we're going to go through this real quickly and just kind of show you. So first of all, we have our parameter, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to sync our rate. And when we sync our rate, now it's giving us options how fast we want to go, a half note, a quarter note, and the D stands for dotted, the T stands for a triplet. And those, again, if you want to look at other videos I've done, I think we cover some of that. So we're going to just do a quarter note, which means that every quarter note, this cycle is going to go through one full cycle per quarter note. And each of these notes here in the scale are one quarter note. So what you're going to have here happen with this volume is it's going to start at a medium volume, get real loud, and then get almost, and then get so quiet you can't hear it, and then come back to a medium volume to start the next note. All right. And so we're going to just play this real quick, and you'll kind of hear what's happening. And if you look at this, there's sort of a visual diagram of what's happening here as this goes. All right. And we can slow that down to, say, a half note, which means for every two of these notes that are being played, it'll go through this cycle. And it's all it's doing is it's changing the volume, and the volume is getting, starting at a medium volume here, it's getting louder, and then it's getting quieter, and then it's getting louder and quieter, so on and so forth, right? Yeah. We can turn down the depth of it, and so the volume change will be less noticeable. So it is getting a little bit quieter, but it's not going completely away in volume when we turn down this depth. And the higher we have this depth, the more the effect is being heard, the movement, the more the volume is affecting the volume parameter is being affected by the sound. We can do it every eighth note, which means that every note is going to get loud, quiet, loud, quiet. It'll get loud and quiet twice before it moves on to the next note. And we're getting some like vibrato-y kind of vibes now with that sound. And if you go real high with it, now you're going to get into some kind of craziness going on. Remember, this is kind of close to that 200 hertz, and so this is going to sound a little wonky, I imagine. Because it's going so fast. It's modulating the volume so fast that it's actually going faster than our ears can pick up, and it's doing some very wonky things to it. But you can get anything from some vibrato effects to just some subtle movement. So like we can really slow it down and have that just happen over the course of one measure. So now the volume is going to go up and down, and it's going to take an entire measure for it to go all the way up and all the way down. Right? And so that's all an LFO is doing, is it's taking a low frequency below that 20 hertz or above if you really want to get some wonkiness with it, and it allows you to assign a parameter, and then it's going to control that parameter based on the waveform. So we can keep the volume, and we can change, say, to a square. And then what that's going to do is it's saying that the volume is going to be unaudible, and then it's going to jump to audible, and then off again. And if we do that, say, at a quarter note feel, you get kind of like that no volume, and then volume, and then no volume, and then no volume, and it's very sharp. And it makes it almost sound like, instead of these being full quarter notes, they're more eighth note-y. You can do a triangle, which is a little bit of it's less smooth, but it's still going to be a steep rise and then a descent. You can have it be a saw up, which is going to be a rise and then a steep dip, like a drop, like our sawtooth was. Or a saw down, which is going to be, the volume is going to go down and then crank up. I don't even know what SH stands for, but this would be the shape of whatever this is. Yeah. So you can do different different shapes, and each one is going to kind of have a different effect based on the shape. And all it's doing is it's just, because we've told it volume, all it's doing is controlling the volume over time as we go at a rate we determine, at a depth we determine. We can do this delay thing here so that it's going to not trigger right away, and then it will trigger, which is making it harder to hear. Maybe if we up the rate here. So yeah, you're hearing the first note is kind of stable, and then it gets vibratoed, if you will. And if we have this delay too high, obviously it makes it so that not enough time is happening before the vibrato can even happen. And then the retrigger means each note, it's going to start at the beginning again. And then the sync just allows us to use the hertz now instead of being synced exactly to that 120 tempo. Now we can have some play with it. Let's go ahead and loop this so that we don't have to keep stopping and starting it. But you can have some fun with this. You can automate this rate so that you can really have some fun with it. And this is just volume that's happening here, and it's creating this effect. And so, yeah, all it's doing is making this sound change over time dependent on this wave. We do square. You can also control other parameters with it. So I hope you're kind of understanding this. Oh, I guess we should look at this phase. So in this case, now we're going to start at the top of the triangle. Or the volume goes down and then up instead of up and then down. So these are all just, now not all of these tools are going to be available on every synthesizer, but these are just some fun ways that you can play with the sound that you're getting and create some fun sounds. You can also do stuff like pitch, and we've gone over this before too. Then this can get a little bit wonky when you start doing playing with this pitch parameter. It starts sounding very electronic-y. You can bring this depth down, and so now it's going to have a little bit of that whir kind of thing, but you'll also hear the note itself. All right. That's coarse. You can do fine as well, which means it won't be as, it'll be micro instead of macro jumps, if you will. Yeah, and it's going to sound a little out of tune because it is. It's pulling the pitch of the note up and down as it goes, and so if you had just a single note held out, that might make more sense instead of this constant changing of the notes. And so, depending on what you're doing, here, actually, let's do that real quick. Why not? so you can get kind of an idea. Let's just have one held out long note for 2 bars. And it's taking this one long note and it's just going up and down in pitch, and we can do the same thing for this course. All right. Yeah, so you can have some fun. You can play with the shapes, you can play with the depth, the rate, and it's just changing this sound over time depending on what parameter you're telling it to, and these various settings here, whether you want to sync it, whether you want it to retrigger, all this other stuff. And you can set it to other parameters as well if you want to. And this is going to get more into sound design, so I'm not sure we're going to cover all of this today, but when it says oscillator 1, well, that's this square here, and there are settings here that you can do to manipulate this square to make it sound different, that it will also change over time. So we're going to get more into the different parameters of what you can use this LFO on when we get into synthesis and sound design. But just as kind of a preview, you can turn some of these different knobs and you can change what this waveform looks like. And you can have these parameters affect the different these parameters. So for instance here, just as an example, because I brought it up, if we play our single note here with this square and we were to say play with this sync, you will hear the sound of this change. Let's turn off our LFO for now. And so you can hear how that is changing the sound. So if we were to link this to oscillator 1, this has 3 different oscillators. You can have actually 3 different waveforms play at the same time. Oscillator 1 we have chosen as a square. We'll get into this more later. This will make more sense when we get into the synthesis. But we can go to, that was the sync. So we'll come to oscillator 1 sync. And then now this is going to control this knob. So instead of having to do this ourselves, our oscillator is actually going to turn this knob up and down for us. All right. And so it's just turning this knob up and down for us. And if we were to turn this back off again, so that's nothing happening. All right. And so that's kind of some of the things you can do with the with this parameter. And these buttons are kind of like another sort of depth or mix knob, if you will. And we can change the sound or the... Okay. And so, yeah, these are just different ways that you can control the parameters of the sound to make it change over time. And so, and then the last thing we're going to look at is filters. So this would control these filters over here. And filters are EQ, okay? So if you're wondering what filters are, there's just another way of saying EQ. And each of these is doing a different type of EQ. LP stands for low pass, HP stands for high pass, and BP stands for band pass, which is like a peak. And if you've watched my EQ video, you should kind of understand what low pass and high pass and band pass and all that kind of stuff is. We covered all that. And you can also get some various other options like our poles. And this is kind of where phase comes into. We're going to cover in a future video. But if we were to, say, do a low pass, which allows our low frequency information to stay and gets rid of our high frequency information, and we were to come over here and assign this to frequency, our filter 1 frequency. Well, what that doing essentially is, if we were to bring up, there's no visual way to do this in that software. But what that is basically doing is this. If we were to, let's just turn that off for now. And we'll bring our EQ in, and it's just doing... So that's what the LFO is doing, is it's just moving this back and forth at a steady rate so that it's getting rid of more and more of the high frequency as it goes, and then it brings them back in, and then it gets rid of them, and that brings them back in. So that's all that's doing when we set it up to that filter knob at the frequency point. So we'll set that back up. I just want to give you a visual representation of what was actually happening there. All right. So you can have some fun with it. And so that's all an LFO is doing, is it's just controlling a parameter that you choose over time based on the waveform you choose, the rate, the depth, and all that kind of stuff. And so this is going to be available in any plugin. Now, there are manual ways to do this. Like I said, you can control LFOs manually. For instance, if we were to bring this back, turn this all the way off, you could do a, you could write in automation and then just manually do this yourself, which, you know, takes some time and effort to set up and all that kind of stuff. Or you can go in and have it just do that automatically with your LFO, right? But I mean, you could manually do this. And have that be, you know, written in. So if we were to do that manually. Okay. And then we go look at our right. Now, obviously, it's not very smooth. And so it might take some time and some practice to get this to look a little bit smoother. But here's what it would sound like if we play that back. All right. Conversely, we can turn this off. We can undo that automation. And we can just have our LFO do that exact same thing for us automatically. And we can sync it to say like a quarter note. Right? You can have some fun with it. And you can even automate the rate and these other parameters here if you wanted for your LFO. But it's just an automated way of doing some of the things you could do manually if you so desired. And it's just going to be based on the waveform you are choosing. So, you know, we can do a triangle here. And in this particular program, it also allows you to control multiple parameters at the same time. So we can have it do that frequency, and we can also have it do, say, the that morph thing from earlier, right? Well, it should be anyways. I'm not sure why it is not. Fascinating. It should be synced to... Oh, because I got it on the wrong control. That would be why. All right. Yeah. Sometimes I'm an idiot, and that's okay. But we get there in the end. To sync, not morph, obviously. Yeah, and so now it's controlling this waveform is controlling both the frequency and the sync parameters at the same time. You can also, if you wanted to, and not all LFOs are going to have all of these options available to you. This particular program just happens to allow me to have multiple LFOs controlled by, or multiple parameters controlled by the same LFO, or I can choose one LFO to control, say, the frequency, and then I can come to another LFO and have that be the one that controls the that sync function we were just looking at, and I have control over it individually of this one, right? So I can set a different depth, a different rate, all of that fun jazz. All right, and we can control that completely independently of all right. Yeah. And so, again, just a way to make your sound change over time. I'm hoping that this is all making sense. I know it can be a lot to wrap your head around, kind of understanding the concept of the different waveforms, how they sound, and then how you can kind of control them over time and link these LFOs or low frequency oscillators to control the parameters. But I'm trying to simplify it as best as I can, but I know there's a lot to kind of go over, but hopefully this is all making sense and you're still with me. It's just a way to change to control a given parameter, whatever that parameter is, and different LFO, there's a lot of options here, as you can see, and we're going to go into these more in depth later when we get into synthesis itself and cover kind of all of what's going on here in the synthesizer. But the LFO itself is kind of the building block of the modulation, because modulation is just changing the sound over time. And guess what? That's exactly what this LFO is doing, is it's just changing the sound over time, and you can choose the parameter or parameters that you want to set and have it change. And you can, play with the different shapes of the LFO, whether it's a sine, a square, a saw, etc. You can choose the different parameters that it will be affecting. You can choose how fast it's going, how much that, the given parameter is being affected or not, how obvious you want the effect to be or not, if that makes sense. Whether you want it to be synced or not synced, you can have some fun with this. But this is an LFO in a nutshell. It's just automatically controlling whatever parameter you set automatically as the song or as the sound is being played. Yeah. And so you can have some fun with it. So anyways, that is our deeper dive into LFOs. We have not covered everything there is to know about LFOs, but with this information, you should have the foundational building blocks to be able to at least understand what an oscillator is, what a low frequency, the difference between a regular like just an oscillator and a low frequency oscillator. In this case, an oscillator is a waveform generator, if you will, okay? And it's just oscillating between the waveforms at different frequencies, as we went into, and how fast or how frequent those peaks and dips are. It will determine the pitch, whether it's lower or higher. But that is going to be different, although similar to what a low-frequency oscillator is doing. A low-frequency oscillator is using these oscillators to generate at a very low frequency over time different parameters that control the sound of whatever waveform you're using. And LFOs can be used on other things besides just synthesizers. You can use LFOs on guitars, on vocals, on other things. And one of the ways that they are implemented is with choruses, flangers, phasers, and other modulators, as we're going to get into over the next few weeks as we take a deeper dive into what those effects are. And you can start to see how LFOs are used to control those parameters of those different effects. So anyways, I hope this has been helpful. I hope you have a better understanding of oscillators and LFOs and how you can use them in your own productions. And we're going to get into a deeper dive into chorus, flangers, phasers, etc. in future videos. Until then, I hope you guys have yourselves a wonderful week, a great day, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.